All during the reconnaissance period during the morning, we kept the standard American flag flying the entire time. The first thing I did when I took the watch and noticed that our steaming colors were fairly dirty because we'd been steaming at high speed for several days, I had our last clean, bright colors put up. And then I watched all morning to see that they were not only up, but that they were displayed, held out in the wind so that the aircraft could see them. Every time I instructed the quartermasters, I said, your most important duty up here is to keep that flag so it doesn't ever wrap around the mast or tangle in the lines or any way that the airplanes can't see it. Just keep an eye, and the lookouts too, I told them, keep an eye on that flag all the time and see that it's kept out. At the same time, we were steaming at 5 knots. We were headed usually directly into a 7-knot wind, so we had 12 knots of wind most of the morning across the flag, which is plenty to hold it out well displayed so anybody could see it. The most notable thing during my watch during the morning was the extent of reconnaissance by the Israelis. There was a fairly close circle of the ship by an Israeli reconnaissance plane before I took the watch at about 6 or 6:30. And then during my watch, there were continual overflights of about every 40 minutes or hour all morning long by aircraft that were usually clearly marked with the Israeli Star of David and low enough that we could see the markings. Usually these were NOR Atlas 2501 obvious reconnaissance planes. Would circle the ship at quite low level, often low enough that we could see the pilots. Our crew members waved to the pilots and could actually see the pilots waving back. You could make out the pilots in their cockpits clearly, make out their facial features. At one point we were circled quite low by 2 jet aircraft with rockets hanging under the wings that circled the ship 3 times. On at least one other occasion, there was a NOR Atlas that passed down up the starboard side, crossed in front, down the port side, and then came over directly over the ship while the captain was on the bridge at very, very low level. I'd say less than 200 feet over the ship. It was so low that the captain, who was standing with me at the time, commented, "Watch those bomb doors. If you see bomb doors start to open, make an immediate hard right turn." And actually, I don't think it had bomb doors, and they didn't open, but you could see what looked like camera ports under the airplane. During the noon hour, I was relieved by Lloyd Painter, and I left to check on my duties below and to have some lunch, and I probably wasn't going more than 20 minutes. I came back on the bridge because I had responsibilities with general quarters. I was training to be general quarters officer of the deck. So I resumed the watch at 1 o'clock. We had the quarters drill, and at 2 o'clock, just as the general quarter was ending, and just as I returned the responsibilities of the bridge back to Lieutenant Painter, the radar had been reported high-speed surface craft, motor torpedo boats actually, from the direction of Tel Aviv, 16 miles away, approaching at 30 knots. And now that's very, very fast. Immediately they then reported that there are high-performance aircraft passing right over the top of the boats, also at 16 miles from the direction of Tel Aviv. We were at that point not alarmed because these airplanes had been passing us all day long. Some of our intercept operators had heard them reporting to the Israeli headquarters that we were an American ship, that they saw men on deck, that they saw our American flag, so we were not at all alarmed. We tried to get some photographs. I walked up on the next deck with Chuck Rowley, who was a photographer on the ship, trying to take some pictures. There were probably 12 or 15 of us up there on the 04 level, 4 decks above the main level. Chuck started taking some pictures, and someone yelled that he's firing. There were flashes under the wing. First thing I felt was a tremendous amount of heat. I turned my left side toward the heat to protect myself. I raised an arm, and all the men around me dropped. I was thrown against a railing. I could see 4 or 5 men on the forecastle and around the gun mounts on the forward part of the ship. Orange flashes from the rocket hits just walked down the deck of the ship, and the men in the forward gun mounts literally thrown up in the air. I was, as I say, thrown back against the railing. My left leg was broken above the knee, and I had about 35 wounds from metal fragments from the rockets. Yet I was the only one left standing on my one good right leg, and I looked up. I heard the airplane pass overhead and swoosh and then silence. And I looked ahead, and here's the second plane making its turn to come down firing. And I hopped down on my good right leg into the pilot house and fell literally in a puddle of blood. Just as the second airplane hit, big holes ripped in the side of the ship and men falling and all kinds of pretty terrible things happening. It was about that time that the entire starboard wing of the bridge burst into literally a wall of flame. You could look out the starboard door of the pilot house and you couldn't see anything but flame out there. And the captain stepped through the flame as if it didn't exist, and he called out, "Fire, fire!" In the pilot house. Call away the fire party. And it seemed like immediately firemen with hoses running up and down the ladders and fire extinguishers and so forth. The airplanes continued to hit us again and again. Finally, word was passed to stand by for a torpedo attack because those boats that we had picked up earlier on radar were now within firing range. They fired, we learned ultimately, they fired 5 torpedoes, missed with 4. Only one of them hit us just about directly below where I was. It blew a 40-foot hole in the side of the ship, instantly killed 25 men. There had been 9 others dead or dying from the aircraft and from injuries from machine gunning from the torpedo boats. Then the torpedo boats came closer, examined us from very close range, and then started to circle the ship, machine gunning the men who were on deck and anything that moved. People who were putting out the fires. The last airplane runs dropped napalm, and some of the airplane runs burst open 255 gallons of gasoline, which are set on fire. So we had 110 gallons of flaming gasoline dripping down ladders, and we were trying to put those things out. So the torpedo boats fired upon the men fighting those fires. Finally, word was passed to prepare to abandon ship, at which point Lieutenant Painter started evacuating the wounded men in stretchers up to the main deck so that they could go into the lifeboats if necessary. Some life rafts, 3 inflatable life rafts, were dropped over the side. The torpedo boats came closer, machine gunned the empty life rafts, and there was American naval attaché with the American embassy there in Tel Aviv. He came out by helicopter and incredibly dropped a business card, a calling card among the bodies on the forecastle and asked if anybody would. And almost immediately the cover-up started. It was within just a very few hours of the end of the attack and of the word from Washington that we started getting messages from Washington saying no one will talk about this. All press releases will come from the Pentagon and be directed by the Pentagon. And it worked that way. We were told literally from the beginning that anything that there's going to be a court of inquiry, that the court of inquiry will investigate and report everything, and because of this proceeding, we'll wait until after the court of inquiry before anything will be said by the crew. After the court of inquiry, you'll be free to talk. It took until about June 27th, about another 3 weeks, before the Court of Inquiry's report was produced and released. It turned out to be what most of us consider an incredible whitewash. It was a report about 23 pages long, It made findings of fact and conclusions which were totally opposite of what we had seen. Instead of describing an extended air attack, it indicated that there was maybe 5 or 6 minutes of air attack and a single torpedo, and that we were then told that we were now free, because the Court of Inquiry report had been published, we're now free to talk to the press. However, since the Court of Inquiry has reported officially everything that is not classified, the only thing you can tell the press is what is in the Court of Inquiry, and in fact you must use the same words that the Court of Inquiry used, so we recommend that you not bother because there's nothing left for you to say. The crew was then reminded almost daily in talks given by visitors from Washington and captain and so forth that you can't say anything that wasn't in the Court of Inquiry, and that any interviews with the press must be cleared with the public affairs officer at the base in Norfolk usually, and that's where it stayed. Pretty much struck by the Israeli excuse, which was simply blatantly not true. For instance, the Israelis tell us in their official report, actually there are a number of what they call official reports sent to the United States. They're all different, but generally they tell the story that the attack occurred because airplanes were sent out to investigate a report of shelling of the beach at the little village of El Arish. Well, there was no shelling at the beach. So they say, well, yeah, that's true. There wasn't any shelling from the beach, but we had an erroneous report of shelling from the beach, so that's why we sent the airplanes, or the torpedo boats to investigate. If you ask them, why did you send torpedo boats on a 3-hour mission to investigate shelling of the beach from high-speed surface craft, it seems a little more logical to send airplanes, since you had airplanes in the air. They don't have any answer to that. They say, well, we sent torpedo boats. Then they claim that the torpedo boats picked up the Liberty at 20 minutes past 1, which was 39 minutes before the air attack started. That they made a plotting error and mistakenly plotted the ship as going 32 knots, about 32 miles an hour. This is a massive 500% error, and they say that's justified because they made the mistake over a period. They made the plot over a period of a few minutes, and therefore it was magnified. Well, that's silly, because anybody that runs a radar knows that how much margin of error you're going to get and how long a period you need to make the plot. But nevertheless, that's their story, that they made this terrible error. They thought we were going 32 knots. Therefore, by their gunnery doctrine, we were automatically classified as an enemy vessel. Therefore, it was authorized and legal for them to attack us. They couldn't catch us because 32 knots was about the same as their top speed, so supposedly they called in the aircraft. The official story, which lately there's changed that one recently also, but their official story is that the airplanes came out. The lead pilot, whose name they tell us was Captain Spector, dropped down to 3,000 feet and circled the ship twice looking for a flag, could see none. His second in command dropped down and circled once, could see no flag. They radioed this information to their headquarters and were then told that obviously it's an Egyptian ship and you have permission to attack. And so only then did they throw caution to the wind and come in attacking the ship. Now, they tell us that late in that attack, golly, somebody recognized that it was an American ship. And immediately, they say, after 20 or 25 minutes of strafing, immediately they called off the air attack and sent word to the torpedo boats. Now, the torpedo men say they never got the message, so they continued for another 45 minutes to attack. They claim, of course, that they, when they did draw close enough to see us, clearly, that they finally did see some American markings and promptly stopped firing, and just about anybody on that ship will tell you that the firing continued for another 40 minutes after the explosion. From there on went the cover-up, which has literally persisted to this day. You still find it extremely difficult to find very much information, to find any straight answers from the government about what happened. We did quite recently, through a Freedom of Information Act suit, which has now cost more than $32,000 to pursue. Some people did force from the government a State Department analysis of the Israeli excuse, which shows most of the defects that we just talked about, and literally brands the Israeli excuse as untrue. You would expect that most nations would go back to the attacker and ask for a satisfactory explanation. Our country didn't, and on the contrary, the United States classified that report top secret and locked it away, where it stayed for about 16 years until the Freedom of Information Act brought it out. The Court of Inquiry itself has monumental holes in it. One of the things that we pursue as much as we can is the fact that the Court of Inquiry was simply not conducted in accordance with Navy regulations. Navy Judge Advocate General regulations require that any finding of fact and opinion be supported by evidence, and that the evidence be in the record of the court. You'll find a number of major pieces of fact and opinion which are contrary to the evidence in the file. And for instance, there is a finding of fact that says that the Israelis may have mistaken the ship because the ship's flag probably hung limp at the mast on a windless day. In fact, obviously, as I explained before, it stood out straight with 12 knots of wind across the flag. That fact is documented in the ship's weather logs, which show that there was 12 knots of wind. The court chose not to enter those logs into its file. No explanation of why. I have a copy of the log. There's a copy in my book which shows that the flag certainly stood out. In addition, there are 6 or 7, mostly chiefs and officers, who reported to the Court of Inquiry that they saw the flag standing straight out in a good breeze. They saw low-flying Israeli aircraft in the area at the time who would have seen the flag. No one told the Court of Inquiry that the flag hung limp at any time. Yet their finding is that it probably hung limp and they couldn't see it. Other things, the duration of the attack, how soon it stopped afterward, all these things are quite contrary to the testimony that's in the Court of Inquiry file. We have for years been asking the Navy to look into those conflicts. You know, here's a report that is fallacious. It is contrary to Navy regulations. It's unsupported as it's required to be by evidence. Won't you comment on this? The only comment we get is that the report was signed off and approved, and therefore it's legal, and that's the end of it.